Hello and welcome to Section 4, Lesson 7, Subtitles and Transcripts, Reading Before, While or After Listening. So in this lesson, we're going to look at the following questions. Should you use transcripts or subtitles while listening? And this might have some benefits, you might think, but there are also some downsides, and we're going to look at all of those. We should also discuss when to read if you are going to use text support. Should you read before you listen, while you're listening in parallel, or maybe after you listen? We're also going to discuss using subtitles in other languages briefly. So, for example, using English subtitles to watch movies in Chinese. And then finally, we're going to look at where you can find text support if you want it. So to begin with, we're going to repeat a question I've asked many times. Why are you listening? And this is not for the strategy use we've discussed earlier in this section. This is more what is the purpose of listening? What do you want to improve? Or maybe the point is not to improve, but to understand something. So for example, you can imagine that you're listening to something important. Maybe it's a lecture, maybe it's a colleague talking about something, maybe it is a recorded announcement by your teacher or something else. The point is to understand what it says, and you need that information. Then that's one thing. Your goal is not necessarily to improve listening ability, but to understand. Then the second one here we have is to actually improve listening comprehension. So the goal is to get better at listening. And then finally, you could have other goals with listening. For example, improve your vocabulary or improve your grammar maybe, or some other aspect of learning Chinese. And naturally, it seems good. All of these things are things that we want to do, but they can actually be in conflict with each other. For example, if the main goal is to comprehend and nothing else, well, listening in your native language is actually faster. So if you have something that you could translate or where you can switch languages, then of course doing that in your native language would give better results. But then you wouldn't learn any Chinese, so that's not necessarily a good thing. And as we shall see, reading here along with listening is one of these things that yield different results depending on what your goal is. So for example, if your goal is to build vocabulary, seeing the words written down can be helpful, but if you always see things you're listening to, that is not very realistic, and that might not be good for your listening comprehension over time, even though it helps you understand more right now, and maybe also helps improve your vocabulary more than pure listening would. So these are some things we are going to talk about here, and that also includes other differences or other goals you might have, such as enjoying yourself, or because you must listen to something, and so on. So all these things interact, and in this lesson then we're going to talk about how listening and reading can interact with each other. So first, let's look at some of the benefits of using some kind of text support. And I'll switch words here: text support, subtitles, transcripts. It's just a way of saying things written down, spoken audio or spoken Chinese written down. And the benefit here is that it allows for an extra path to comprehension. So if you fail to understand something simply by listening, well, if you can also read, then you have a second chance of understanding what's being said, essentially. And that is a good thing. It also means that if there is something you don't know, it's much easier to look up, because you can copy-paste from a transcript, or you can see how it's written down, and that is more absolute. If you hear something sometimes, it might be hard to hear the tones maybe, or it's hard to make out the words from each other. If there are, for example, two unknown words, where's the boundary between them, and how should you parse this unknown section? But if you see that in writing, this is not a problem. You can also it's easier when you can pause. If you're watching a movie, for example, with subtitles, you can pause, you can check things, and if you pause only spoken Chinese, well, there is no audio and you cannot hear anything. So clearly there are some benefits to using a written, say, transcript or subtitles. There is another benefit that I think is nice. Sometimes you hear things over and over, but you don't really understand what they're saying. Maybe you hear an expression over and over, and you know kind of what it means, but you might not have looked it up. But if you see it in writing, sometimes that's enough to understand what it means and actually learn it. So having these dual paths to comprehension, I think, is generally speaking a good thing for many reasons. However, this doesn't mean it's good all the time. But if you can, choose materials that already have transcripts or some kind of written support. This makes it a lot easier. Towards the end of this lesson, we will talk about how you can create or find transcripts or other forms of text support, but it's always easier to choose something that already has it. So we looked at different goals here, and in this course, the goal is mainly to focus on listening ability. And the thing is that comprehension is not everything. Like I said, if comprehension was the only goal, well, then you could just translate everything using, say, some kind of AI tool, and then you would understand everything that's being said because it's in your native language. But the goal is to also understand the Chinese you're listening to. Or rather, we can say that comprehension is good, but only as far as it also improves your Chinese. So that means that having text support all the time is not always good. There are definitely some negative or some downsides. For example, if you are watching a movie in Chinese with subtitles in English, and you're reading the subtitles all the time, are you actually listening to the Chinese at the same time? Are you trying to understand what they say? Or are the subtitles so much easier to access that you read instead of listening? Because then it doesn't really help that you're listening to Chinese if you're only focusing on the familiar written English. Of course, if you have subtitles in Chinese, that is a little bit different. And then we're getting into more things that are more useful, not necessarily for listening purposes, but we will talk about that later. But subtitles in other languages, it could be good if your main reason for listening is maybe to build motivation, or because you really like something. Maybe you're interested in something culturally related, or you want to watch a movie you just like, but you don't have the Chinese to understand everything in Chinese. Then watching something with subtitles in English occasionally is fine, just as long as you realize that the main thing here is not to improve your listening comprehension. So you could also listen for other purposes. For example, one of the reasons that I recommend listening so much, and this is something we talked about earlier in this course as well, is of course because it helps you build other abilities. If you listen enough, this will spill over to your speaking, and you will build vocabulary and grammar, which is also useful for reading and writing. So I'm not necessarily saying that you should only listen for the purpose of improving listening ability. There are other reasons to listen. So in that case, I would say that listening with transcripts or subtitles is a good thing if it improves your comprehension. However, it's not a given that including subtitles, or say reading a transcript while also listening, actually does improve comprehension. This assumes that your reading ability is already quite good. I mean, if you're reading at half the speed of the spoken audio, then that doesn't really make much sense. You're not going to get anything extra from the reading, or indeed, as I said earlier, if you spend all your time reading instead of listening, it could be it's a bit questionable that you're actually practicing listening much at all. And that doesn't necessarily need to be a bad thing. I say that only because this course is focused on listening comprehension. You could also say that the main point of this activity is actually to read, and I'm essentially reading with audio support. It's not primarily meant to improve my listening comprehension. Then I think this type of parallel reading and listening can be really good. So let's discuss when you should read. So we have now seen that you can have text support, and sometimes this is very beneficial. But we've mostly talked about doing this in parallel or while listening. So there are a bunch of other options here, or to be more exact, 3 of them. And we can then read before we listen, we can read while we listen in parallel, like we discussed, or we can read after we listen. And here I think it matters quite a lot in which order we do things. So let's have a look at this. The thing is that if you're reading before you're listening, your reading becomes meaning focused. And so that means that your goal is to understand the text and to see what it's about. But then when you listen, and remember that means you've read the text before you listen, this is no longer very meaning focused, because you know exactly what this text is about. You know who's in it, what they're doing, what they're saying, what the topic is, and everything, because you just read it. So when you're listening to it, this is not really meaning focused. It's more like a slightly artificial exercise in seeing how things are pronounced or linking the spoken language to the written language. And there is nothing wrong with this type of activity, but it is not terribly good if the goal is to increase increase your listening ability, then we need this meaning-focused listening. You need to listen to Chinese, try really hard to understand what they're saying. But if you know in advance exactly what they're saying, you're not trying very hard, and it doesn't really count as good listening practice. You can still use this sometimes, especially when the goal then isn't necessarily to improve your listening ability. I should say, though, that you can read some things. For example, in the lesson about tests, I said that it can be beneficial to understand if you say read the questions in advance. And when we talked about listening strategies in general, activating prior knowledge and things like this is very beneficial, and that is something you should still do. So you can create this or access this in different ways, even before you listen. So it's one thing if you read a transcript of what you're going to say in advance, and another if you are reading, say, a summary, or if you're checking headlines, or just a bullet list of what this thing is about. That sets you up for a better listening situation, because, as I've mentioned throughout this course, you rarely enter into a listening situation in real life where you have no clue about what you're going to hear. So having some bullet points or a summary of what something is about in English or in Chinese, just knowing about the content roughly, is actually a good thing. And this does not count as, it can still count as listening practice, and it can be good for your listening practice. Then we talked about reading while listening. And like I said, this offers an extra path to comprehension, which can be a good thing if you have the reading skill necessary. But if you don't, it can also distract you from the listening part of the exercise. And then that's obviously not very good listening practice. But still, having this transcript available means that it's very easy to pause and look things up and so on. And you can see how things are written down and all these good things that we talked about. But remember, why are you listening here? Is it primarily to improve your listening comprehension? Well, I don't think you should have access to text when you do that, because, well, that's not how you listen in real life. We're not there yet when people can walk around with, subtitles and a heads-up display where you can see what people are saying in writing. And maybe when we get there, this will be more relevant. But you need to prepare for real-world listening. That's what you want, and that rarely comes with subtitles. Then we come to the final kind of sequencing option, which is to put the the reading at the end. So you listen first and then you read. And there are very few drawbacks of doing this, especially if you give yourself the chance to understand more than once. You listen more than once, and when you've reached kind of your limit, this is how much I'm going to understand, then you read. I see almost no downsides with doing this. And in fact, if you feel up to it, I recommend doing this most of the time when you listen. And obviously, for practical reasons, this is not something you'd actually want to do. If you listen to, several podcast episodes, going through all of them in writing will take a very long time. And I don't recommend doing that. But when you have the chance, do it. I recommend you to not do it all the time, mainly because it's time-consuming and impractical, but looking at things you have listened to is very beneficial. It can help you in many ways. For example, there might be things you couldn't figure out, ambiguities, words that you're not sure what they mean, and this gives you an opportunity to look them up, to study them if you want, and to solidify your understanding of the text. You might have understood 90%, but after you read, you understand 100%, and this can be quite helpful. You can also link the spoken language to the written language and link these two different things or different aspects of the Chinese language together, just like you can if you were reading and then hearing what you are reading, as we discussed earlier. Both these are worthwhile on their own. It also allows you an easy way to search for things. So, for example, if you save transcripts from podcast episodes you've studied and worked your way through, well, then you can easily find things by searching. This is quite hard if you don't have text support of any kind. There are other reasons to listen first, listen before you read, and one of them is a very practical one. It's easier to find good reading materials than it is to find good listening materials, so that means that you shouldn't waste your listening materials practicing your reading. But doing the opposite is rarely an option. If there is no audio, well, you could maybe generate it, but it's not going to be as good. So this means that you get the most out of these listening resources that you find, and you can then, reading resources are rarely a problem. Generally speaking, it's also better to read after you listen than vice versa. I mean, you can get a lot of reading practice by reading something you've already listened to, but as I said earlier, listening to something you've already read is much less useful practice. And I think this is mostly related to the fact that decoding Chinese characters in itself will work as an exercise, even if you know the content, whereas listening to something where you already know the content is less beneficial. I could see exceptions to this. So, for example, listening to something you have read previously, much later for review purposes, is still a good idea. So I'm not saying you should never listen to something you've already read. I mean, if you have read something, or maybe you read something for a completely different reason, then accessing the audio and listening to that for review purposes later, or just to see what it sounds like, is perfectly fine. I'm just saying, if you have the option, if you're choosing when to access this transcript, or if you're supposed to enable the subtitles the first time you listen, well, I think no, you should do the listening first, and then after you've listened at least once, then you can read. So where do you find the text support then? Well, you can buy it, you can find it online, you can buy it, and you can sometimes also create it on your own. But the most important lesson here is that if there is text support already, that makes things a lot easier. And if you find, a podcast you really like, but it doesn't have transcripts, well, maybe that's okay then. You can try to find some way around this. But if you have a bunch of podcasts to choose from, actually choosing one that has transcripts, I think, is a good option, because then you have access to this and you don't have to waste time, finding or creating the subtitles yourself. Most podcasts, at least those aimed for language learners, also have paid transcripts. That's usually one of the perks you get when you subscribe to them or when you give them money somehow. And this is a fairly worthwhile thing to do because, like I said, it saves you the hassle of creating subtitles on your own. Or if you don't have subtitles at all, some things will be harder, as we have seen, such as looking things up, studying them, and so on. You could also create subtitles yourself. I'll put some recommendations in the lesson notes, but there are software for various platforms where you can generate transcripts based on audio. And some platforms do this automatically, or they have the option to do so at least. So for example, on YouTube you can do that, and on Spotify as well. So this could be an option, but like I said, you are essentially wasting time or spending time fiddling with these tools rather than just listening to Chinese or reading Chinese. And that is, doesn't help your listening comprehension, so if you can get away from doing that, that's quite worthwhile. So what did we learn in this lesson? Well, we learned that subtitles and transcripts and other forms of text support can provide an extra path to comprehension, and that generally speaking, this is a good thing. However, this also assumes, at least if you are reading while you're listening, that your reading speed and reading skill is up to par. Otherwise, it will mostly be distracting. We also discussed when to do this. Should you do it before you listen? Should you read while you listen? Or should you read after you are listening? And this depends then on what your goal is. Why are you listening? And if you're after listening comprehension and improving that, you have to read after you listen, because that's the way real life works. And if you read in advance, it essentially means you're spoiling the listening practice. So don't do that. Focus on listening first. If you want to get good at listening, you need to listen. And if you are going to read, or if you are going to use the transcripts or subtitles or whatever it is, make sure to do that after you've given listening a chance. Listen once, listen twice, and then when you get stuck, you can't get any further, well, that's when you turn on the subtitles or pick up the transcript. So that's it for this lesson. 谢谢收看, and see you in the next one.